Peekaboo! Hello again. Think of the last time you played peekaboo with a baby or saw someone else playing it. At a particular stage of development, this game delights and totally captures a baby's attention. Why do you think this is? Babies at this stage don't expect to see your face hidden behind your hands. When you reveal your face, it's a surprise, and a lovely one at that. Babies love happy, smiley faces. And it is this deeply embedded evolutionary emotion of surprise that holds their attention. In his book, The Expressions of the Emotions in Man and Animals, Charles Darwin considered surprise to be one of the primary emotions in humans. But even a long time before him, great thinkers were waxing eloquent about the importance of surprise, particularly in learning. The Greek philosopher Aristotle believed philosophers were first led to philosophy by wonder. By philosophy, he meant science, religion, art, knowledge, and meaning. And wonder is an emotion that encompasses surprise. It's clear the great thinkers of the past had a sense of the importance of surprise. Intuitively, it makes sense, doesn't it? Something that provokes surprise or wonder must surely make us more attentive and therefore in the ideal state of mind for learning. But let's look at the evidence and learn what modern psychologists and scientists have to say about the interconnections between neuroscience, psychology, and surprise. In a 2017 article, The Cognitive Evolutionary Model of Surprise, psychologists reviewed evidence from past research and found strong indications that unexpected events, or surprises, caused an interruption in mental processes. This interruption is usually followed by a shift in attention, which in turn is followed by the brain's analysis of the events and a change of prior understanding. In other words, learning. They also found clear evidence that surprise had both motivational and informational effects. An MIT study published in 2022 used mental imaging to find evidence that the brain changes when it responds to a surprising event. The study found that unexpected outcomes trigger a release of noradrenaline. Noradrenaline, or phasic dopamine, is one of several neuromodulators that influence the chemistry of the brain, along with dopamine and other neurotransmitters. However, unlike regular dopamine, phasic dopamine floods large areas of the brain and therefore has more general effect, which is important for survival and brain regulation. Researchers found that the release of phasic dopamine generated by a surprising event helped the brain focus attention and learn from the event more so than regular dopamine. Researchers from Johns Hopkins University found that the element of surprise helps babies learn significantly better. Do you remember peekaboo? When discussing the babies they studied, the researchers say once they saw something that surprised them, their engagement with the object peaked, and their learning behavior improved significantly. And they were able to learn faster and more efficiently, as opposed to babies who were not surprised. So, surprise influences motivation and attention and gets the brain in a state where it's ready to learn. But what happens afterwards? How does surprise influence memory? A 2020 paper published in the journal Developmental Science, covering developmental psychology and cognitive neuroscience, looked at the influence of curiosity and surprise on the memory of children and adolescents. It corroborated the widely understood idea that curiosity enhances memory from childhood all the way through to adolescence. It also found that surprise played a greater role in memory in adolescence compared to younger children. I have always felt, intuitively, that surprise has a positive effect on learning. But I was genuinely surprised to see such overwhelming scientific evidence for it. But it's there. and you can learn how to harness it in your math class and your own life. Before we delve into that, let's look at another related impact of surprise on thriving and becoming the best version of yourself. In other words, how surprise impacts your self belief. Psychologist Michael Russell is a researcher of neuroscience and wrote the book Power of Surprise: How Your Brain Secretly Changes Your Beliefs, which was published in 2021. In it, he describes the findings from interviews with middle school students. His research first began while he was studying the effect of hypnosis. It's a fascinating story. Russell was trying to find out why hypnosis created suggestibility. For instance, kids who believed themselves to not have any musical talent, when hypnotized, could suddenly sing beautifully. Russell was interested to know what was happening in the brain to shift into a state of self belief that wasn't there before. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could find a way for all students to have that same kind of growth mindset? Russell did his PhD in the 80s on the hypnotic conditions of the classroom. As part of his study, he hypnotized students, with their parents' permission to hypnotize them, of course. He says parents were only too happy, and one of them even suggested if he'd throw in hypnotizing their kids to take out the garbage. He found that the kids were most suggestible when there was high emotional arousal. This is a state when emotions peak, when something triggers a strong emotional reaction. That's when those students who believed they couldn't sing or dance suddenly could. But he wanted to go deeper and understand the mechanism that changed these beliefs, particularly if there was a way of using it without hypnotism. Russell collected stories about particular moments that changed people, moments that made them feel differently about themselves. I invite you to think of a moment that changed your belief about some aspect of yourself. Think of this moment and what caused it as you hear about Russell's findings. What he found in all those stories was a commonality. Most of the changes were triggered by surprise. Let me share one of his stories as an illustration. Laurie was a middle school child who struggled with tests, particularly math tests. She would get anxious when she noticed other kids around her turn over their test papers to the next page, scribble away furiously, finish and leave. She was always the slowest one, and she put this down to her lower intelligence. One day, while she was still in the library doing her test after her classmates had left, the librarian walked by and commented, "Wow, kid, your thoroughness and attention to detail is fantastic." This was a completely unexpected remark to Laurie. She was surprised by it because it changed her belief about what it meant to be intelligent, which was to be quick. The comment also challenged the belief that she had about herself and her math ability. This little remark was a jolt that caused her to shift how she perceived herself and what it means to be intelligent. Since that day, she writes slowly and methodically and does much better in her tests because she is no longer anxious and has self-belief. The teacher's comments precipitated a change in her mindset because it surprised her. This was one of Russell's first findings, that surprise can be linked to mindset change. He then spent 6 years studying the neuroscience of surprise and how it changed beliefs. He found that comments that were surprising produced lasting and growing influence. He likens it to reinforcement on steroids. And he says the element of surprise is a belief revision reflex. It revises a person's deeply held belief. Laurie reversed her emotions from embarrassed to proud, along with a revision of her belief as a non-math person to a math person. Russell explains that when someone labels a behavior as objective reality, it acquires value. Most of us simply accept those labels. Matter-of-fact comments often sound like observations of truth, like saying, "You are wearing a red scarf." The act of noticing and then labeling a behavior tends to reinforce that behavior. Let's look at what happens when a behavior is labeled and when the labeling is unexpected. Russell says labeling a behavior during a surprise not only reinforces it, but this new label also etches itself into long-term memory. A new belief emerges. Let me give you a brief explanation of the neuroscience behind how and why this works. When the brain experiences a strong surprise, it produces phasic dopamine, specifically a two-phase burst of dopamine from the motivator neurotransmitter. Evolutionary, this was important, a burst of super concentration to say, "Really look at this, it's a risk," or something useful to learn. Phase 1 lasts less than a second and is called salience. Your brain is on high alert, broadcasting the message, "Something important is happening, so pay attention." Phase 2 is slightly longer and is called valence. Your brain processes and assesses the information. Is this good or bad? Should I approach or avoid? This second phase initiates the formation of a belief. In Laurie's case, the belief was, "I'm a deep thinker." This entire process happens as if in secret. We are not really aware of it. What are the implications of these ideas for you as a teacher? You can look for moments of truth to change your students' beliefs and mindsets. In Laurie's examples, consider the impact on the whole class if a teacher says out loud, "Wow, Laurie, you keep on going with such care and attention, really taking your time to think deeply." It could affect not just Laurie's belief about herself and what it means to be intelligent in math, but could also change the attitude of the whole class who heard this comment. The important takeaway from Russell's work is, as he says, not all surprises produce belief changes, but all belief changes were probably triggered by surprise. Knowing surprise leads to learning, and that how we interpret the learning can lead to positive change in beliefs. Think about how powerful it would be if you could use this understanding to focus on shifting beliefs to improve your life, the lives of others, and particularly the lives of your students. Join me in the next lesson where we look at the deep relationship between mathematics and surprise.